A storm is rolling in across the plains, and you have maybe 2 hours before it hits. There is no lumber yard. There is no hardware store. What you have is a stack of pine poles, 18 tanned buffalo hides sewn into one enormous cover, and everyone you grew up with. By the time the rain starts, your home needs to be standing, warm, and able to survive winds that would flatten a modern tent in minutes. This is not a survival stunt. This is Tuesday for thousands of years on the Great Plains. The teepee looks simple from a distance: a cone, some poles, animal hide. Simple is the wrong word. Every angle of that cone was solving a problem, and the people solving it were engineers who never called themselves that. Start with the hides, because nothing else happens without them. A single teepee cover took somewhere between 8 and 18 tanned buffalo hides, depending on the nation and the size of the lodge, stitched into one continuous, nearly semicircular sheet. Getting there was not quick. Women scraped the flesh and fat off each hide with tools made from bone and stone, then left it in the sun for days to bleach. After that came a tanning mixture, worked into the hide by hand, a paste of buffalo brain, liver, grease and bark, rubbed in with a smooth stone until the fibres gave. Then it went back into the sun, stretched, dried, rubbed again and again, sometimes for a week straight, before a single hide was ready to be cut. The whole cover was smoked over a slow fire at the end, and that is the step that mattered most. Smoke waterproofed the hide. Without it, the first hard rain would have soaked straight through. A finished cover, done right, lasted about 2 years before it was cut down into moccasins and clothing, and the whole cycle started again. That is the part almost nobody puts on camera. The lodge you see going up in a single afternoon usually represents months of invisible labor that happened long before anyone picked up a pole. And the hides still had to become one piece. Once tanned, they were cut to shape and sewn edge to edge. Not with thread, but with sinew pulled from the animal's own back, threaded through holes punched by a bone awl. On a large lodge, that sewing job could pull in 10 to 15 people at once, sitting in a circle, passing the growing cover hand to hand, as it spread wider than any one worker could manage alone. Larry Belletts, a modern tanner who has rebuilt this exact process from museum records and gone on to make more than 40 hide teepees himself, puts it plainly. An 18-foot hide lodge holds roughly 14 buffalo hides, and every one of them took him and his own crew a week of steady work just to tan. Multiply that by 14 hides and you start to understand why the finished lodge felt less like camping gear and more like a family's single biggest possession. The poles came next, and this is where you start to see real variation between nations. Lodgepole pine was the wood of choice wherever it grew. Straight, tall, and light enough for one person to carry. A finished lodge needed anywhere from 15 to 25 poles, some of them 30 feet long, hauled to camp on a travois dragged behind a horse, or, before horses reached the plains, behind a dog. All that timber, plus the cover, could weigh over 500 pounds. Moving an entire village meant moving that weight, multiplied by every family in camp, every few days, sometimes 5 or 6 miles at a time. The word itself comes from Lakota, from Tipi, which just means the place where someone lives. Nothing mystical, nothing exotic. home. And people had been refining this particular kind of home across an enormous stretch of time. Archaeologists trace cone-shaped pole dwellings on the plains back roughly 4,000 years, with most of the physical evidence dating to the last 2500. This was not a shelter invented overnight to solve a sudden problem. It was inherited, argued over, and improved by more generations than anyone could count. But the real engineering is in how those poles came together, and different nations solved it differently. The Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Kiowa raised their lodges on a 3-pole tripod. The Blackfoot, the Crow, and the Hidatsa built on 4. It sounds like a small detail. It isn't. A 3-pole foundation gives the crossed pole tops a slight spiral twist at the peak. A 4-pole foundation groups them flatter, off to the sides. Someone who grew up around lodges could look at the silhouette against the sky from half a mile off and tell you which nation had camped there without seeing a single face. The poles themselves were not free of tools either, even without a single piece of metal. Choosing them meant walking a pine stand and reading which trunks had grown straight enough, checking for rot, testing flex by hand before a single one got cut and stripped of bark. A full set of poles for an average lodge weighed around 400 pounds on its own, with the hide cover adding another 100 to 150. That is close to 550 pounds of house disassembled, riding behind a dog or a horse across open grassland, camp after camp. Here is how the 3-pole method actually worked, because the mechanics matter. 3 poles were laid on the ground and lashed together near one end with rawhide rope, wrapped several times around, finished with a hitch. Then came the part that takes real strength and real trust. 2 people walked the poles upright from underneath, while a third held the rope taut, until the tripod stood on its own, legs spread wide, crossed at the top like a peace sign. Get the spacing wrong and the whole structure leans. Get it right and it holds its own weight before a single other pole goes up. From there, the rest of the poles were laid, one at a time, into the crotch of that tripod, walked into position and dropped around the circle, evenly spaced, until the full frame stood like a wooden rib cage against the sky. The last pole was special. The cover was already tied to it, so raising that one pole meant raising the entire hide skin at once. One woman, using nothing but the leverage of the pole itself, walked that cover up and over the frame from the back of the lodge. There was no pulley, there was no scaffolding. Nobody stood by to catch it if it slipped. It simply did not slip, because the woman doing it had done it 100 times before. The cover came down around the poles like a skirt, wrapped from the back around both sides and pinned shut above the door with wooden lacing pins, sometimes a dozen of them, driven through matching holes punched along the seam. The bottom edge got staked to the ground, tight, so the wind couldn't get a grip underneath. And the shape was never actually a symmetrical cone. It leaned. The floor plan was egg-shaped, not round, with one side noticeably steeper than the other. That steep side always faced the direction the wind came from, which meant the family had built a wind deflector into the shape of their home before ever cutting a single pole. The door faced east toward the rising sun, every time, in every camp, on every plain, from Texas to southern Canada. Then came the smoke flaps, 2 triangular wings of hide near the peak, each controlled by its own separate pole planted outside the lodge. These were adjusted constantly, morning and night, tuned to whichever way the wind was blowing that hour, to pull smoke from the fire pit up and out without choking the family sitting below it. Get that wrong on a still night, and the whole lodge fills with smoke in minutes. Get it right, and a fire burning inside a structure made of animal hide and dry wood keeps a family warm through a plains winter that regularly drops well below zero, with a hide liner hung along the inside walls, trapping a layer of insulating air between the two skins. Total time to raise the whole structure, frame to finished cover, staked and smoke flap set, was 1 to 2 hours. Done most often by the women of the camp, who also owned the lodge outright, chose where it stood in the circle, and decided exactly how and when it came back down again. Inside, the fire sat dead center, ringed by stones, with sleeping robes arranged around the edges where the sloped walls met the ground low enough to lean against. Most covers were left plain, undecorated, hide the color of old cream after smoking. Painted lodges were rarer, reserved for a respected leader's family or a ceremony that called for it, which meant a painted teepee rising in camp was itself a small piece of information, readable at a glance by anyone who grew up understanding what it meant. A hide flap covered the doorway, low enough that anyone entering had to duck, which was itself a small daily reminder to arrive with a bit of humility. Older children learned the whole sequence by helping, not by being taught in the abstract. A 10-year-old girl might spend a summer holding a lashing rope taut, while an aunt walked a tripod upright, long before she was ever handed the responsibility of raising her own family's lodge. Skills like this were not written down anywhere. They lived in muscle memory, passed hand to hand, the same way the sewing circle passed a growing hide cover from lap to lap. For many Plains nations, the lodge was never just shelter. It doubled as a gathering space, a place for prayer, a home in the fullest sense the word can carry. That context matters here, because it is easy to watch 2 hours of footage and see only the mechanics: poles, hides, knots. The mechanics were real, but they were built by people who understood exactly what they were building, and why it needed to be more than 4 walls and a roof. Compare that to what it took European settlers to put up a log cabin on the same land, with axes and hand tools. Weeks, sometimes longer, for something far less mobile in a real plains wind. The teepee was not a lesser structure because it went up fast. It went up fast because roughly 4,000 years of trial and error had already stripped away every unnecessary step. Every angle, every knot, every choice of pole length had already been tested by families whose winter depended on getting it right the first time. There is a reason the finished cover was measured directly against the tripod poles before a single knot got tied. There is a reason the poles were sharpened at the base and sometimes planted a few inches into the ground for extra grip. There is a reason the front pole ran slightly longer than the two behind it, to brace the whole frame against the prevailing wind. None of it was decoration. Every visible piece of a teepee still had a job to do, and nothing was there because it looked good. And when it was time to move on, the whole process reversed, almost as fast as it went up. Pins pulled, cover peeled off and folded, poles pulled from the ground, sorted, lashed into travois frames, and loaded within the hour, ready for the next 5 or 6 miles. A village of 100 lodges could be broken down, packed, and gone by mid-morning, leaving behind nothing but flattened grass and a fire ring already going cold. By the time the storm actually reaches camp, the fire is lit, the smoke flaps are already turned to the wind, and the family that started with a stack of poles and 18 stretched hides is sitting warm and dry, listening to rain that would have soaked through a modern tent an hour ago. They did not outbuild the weather with more material or more time. They outbuilt it with better questions, asked a very long time ago and answered over and over, generation after generation, until the answer became a shape you could raise in under 2 hours with your own hands and no nails at all. So the next time something looks simple enough to dismiss in 5 seconds of footage, it might be worth asking what a few thousand years of getting it wrong actually bought the people who finally got it right.